Welcome back. So this is the really fun part of the MOOC. That moment where you get to turn all of the ideas in the core lectures and your guest presentations into your own work. Every week, remember, you will have the option of a social method approach or what we're calling a worldwide flash mob option. Both should be fun, both should be challenging, but they're quite different. This module has covered a lot of ideas about public art, but also spatial politics, right? And the different things that are at stake in it. So your assignments will deal with those same concepts. Remember to take your inspiration from the many case studies we presented and the very work of your guest presenters or other artists who you may know about. A very important idea in this type of work is that of displacement. Marcel Duchamp is a really famous artist. Most people know of or have heard of him. And while you may not associate him with this idea of urban or rural displacement or spatial displacement, he actually is crucial to understand it. His idea behind what we call the ready-made, a very famous concept by now, but one that he started using about 100 years ago, was that you can take something from any context and turn it into art simply by putting it in the context of art. In other words, it is the museum, the gallery, the very spaces of art, those sacred spaces, that turn something into art. He only had a theory. He had kind of a hunch. So he wanted to prove it. So he created the ready-made. What is a ready-made? It's an object that certainly is not art, or at least was not art when Duchamp was working. And he took that and put it in the Armory show, in a very important exhibition. And the first ready-made was literally a urinal. He put the urinal upside down and signed it with a pseudonym and put it in this art exhibition that accepted all, at least claimed to accept everything that people submitted. He changed the history of art by doing that. For our purposes, what matters is that the displacement he produced ended up transforming not just the world of art, but the world of everyday objects. Artists started looking everywhere after that and seeing what object can I use? What object should be art? And for what you're doing for this assignment in the social method option has to do precisely with displacement. Now, you don't have to choose an object that is either art or intentionally isn't art. But what you're playing with is this idea of a different context. Take something that people associate with one context and put it in another context. It can be an object, but it can also be a habit or a routine. So we tend to brush our teeth in a bathroom. Well, what would happen if you brushed your teeth somewhere else, in a very public place? The idea here is that you're displacing something that belongs in one place to another. And that is your work. We are here at a baseball stadium doing a class. Most classes do not happen in a baseball stadium. Well, that's the idea. So in this MOOC, we've been learning a lot about public art and spatial politics. In the old days, even just a few decades ago, this is what people would have expected of public art. A big sculpture, often of metal, placed in a space where there's some type of public walking around it, sometimes even in an interior. But why does public art really have to happen here? Why can't public art happen here? Or here? Or in a very tight spot like this one? Or even here? Or perhaps here?
Or here?
Or in the bushes? But you know what? Many artists have been asking themselves, why can't public art happen between here and there? Many artists and activists in the last few decades have also wanted to make public art that doesn't just go from here to there in a simple way, but actually deals with urbanism, architecture, with movement across larger parts of a city, an urban grid, perhaps even a rural part. They do long walks, they do caravans. But these types of movements have also happened in airplanes and boats. And that's exactly what you will be doing for your flash mob assignment, the worldwide flash mob assignment this time. We're now going to a special place that will highlight some of the things we want you to deal with. Architecture and urbanism have always had a dimension that is about dividing people, separating them one from the other. This can happen by design. Social classes are separated. Some groups don't want to be mixed in with other groups. But sometimes it is how our spaces grow. And we want you to do a project that directly addresses that identifies a point of tension, and then uses it for your walk, for your caravan. Of course, since it's a flash mob assignment, you will have to invite others to participate. And that's part of the fun, but also the challenge. So let's go there, and we'll show you one very specific example that may give you some ideas. We're here in front of the local prison. Like most prisons, it is a sad place. It can be even tragic, and it has no windows or very, very small windows. People are not allowed to leave, and this one happens to be built right here in the middle of a downtown. Now, what's interesting about this place and why we chose it as an example for you to think about architecture and urbanism and points of tension is that when they decided to build the brand new performing arts center in this town, they put it right here next to the prison. Now, look at this building, all glass, translucent, you know, a place where people can enjoy performances, have fun. Lion King is being presented as we speak. That building next to that one. This is what we could call a point of tension. Say you wanted to do a project here. Well, would you do it and turn it into a walk? Would it be a caravan? Would it be a combination of the two? That should serve as a helpful example, but remember, the idea should come from you. So how you define tension and what a point of tension is in the place where you live is part of the very assignment. It's a flash mob assignment, so remember, invite others to join you who are also there, or turn it into a global virtual platform project. Hello everyone, welcome to the Art of the MOOC, Merging Public Art and Experimental Education. My name is Pedro Lash.
And I'm Nader Thompson.
Today we will focus on a particular area of socially engaged art that basically uses the structures in society as a very medium of the work. We're not necessarily talking about elaborate or experimental structures, but structures of the everyday, like churches, the state, the mail system, all kinds of things that you can think of that you confront in your everyday life.
Yeah, and the history of that is vast because, of course, people do it for different impulses. So some people are trying to react against or to critique or to reform or to reflect upon, whereas perhaps others are literally trying to produce a different world to live within. And these examples can run the gamut from artistic actions to perhaps just citizens that are trying to construct their own lives. For example, I worked on a project called Black Radical Brooklyn. It was a history of African Americans, actually because of the history of slavery, having to produce their own worlds. So these kind of opportunities to produce their own schools, their own land reform, their own structures. This is an opportunity that is beyond the arts. It's everyday life and kind of social structures.
And it particularly makes sense in our area of study for this MOOC, right? Socially engaged art and public art, because by the very word social, we can imply that there's a collective, collaborative endeavor. Mm-hmm. And so that's why these artists, even if they didn't start out there, they end up arriving in these social structures and realize, oh, maybe I should do work about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Nader, can you talk to us about, like, perhaps let's start with markets or like a currency system?
Sure. So let's go that. Why don't we go over to the green screen? Markets. It affects all of us. Markets and economies. The one thing that's interesting is a lot of artists and radicals have often tried to come up with new ways in which we exchange goods. And of course we often think of money as the thing that we do that with, the dollar bill. or the peso, or the yen. But there are artists, of course, that have tried to think through other ways of doing that, and civic people. An example I have is a guy named Paul Glover, who in 1990 came up with what's called the Ithaca dollar in Ithaca, New York. A very magical place. And in Ithaca, New York, he actually established what is the largest alternative currency in America right now. And it was basically $10 of Ithaca money equaled 1 hour of labor. And the idea of correlating labor time, 1 hour, to a certain kind of currency, $10, has a long history. In fact, there was an anarchist commune called Modern Times outside of New York as well that also kind of produced this idea of tying labor to money. Because of course, as you can imagine, someone that's working for minimum wage, their 1 hour is not worth as much as like a CEO's. The other impulse, sure, to do with the Ithaca dollar was that it kept the money within Ithaca. So Paul Glover ran around and he said, hey, hardware store, will you accept the Ithaca dollar? Hey, guy fixing your porch, will you accept the Ithaca dollar? Hey, local doctor, will you accept it? And within the community, they had $110,000 of Ithaca money floating around. So that's one example of a kind of alternative currency.
And that's a great example, and there's so many cases we could study, of alternative currency systems, and it basically highlights how circulation is crucial, right? Yeah. In this case, circulation of money, but it can be about circulation of goods. Artists have dealt with bartering systems, and many of these artists have been heavily influenced by anarchist theory. Yeah. So Lucio Urtubia Jimenez is actually another fantastic example of the most radical manifestation of this type of anarchist philosophy. He was actually a Mason his entire life. He kept a full-time job, and on the side, he forged bank checks. He was involved in bank robberies, and he even met at one point with Che Guevara, even though he was from Spain. He went to Cuba to propose a world plan of how to bring down the capitalist system through basically forgery, right? And Guevara wasn't interested, but later some of the
very romantic man.
He very romantic, and only his closest friends knew that he had his print shop on the side, where he basically would crank out all these, bank checks and so on. One of his scams involved over $3 million of fake checks, and they were never able to imprison him because he never benefited himself for it. Oh. And it's the term that we often use to talk about this type of practice is expropriative anarchism, yeah. But other radical groups were involved in it too. For example, the Black Panthers had a moment where they were robbing banks that would feed back. They weren't about enriching themselves, but it was about feeding back into the alternative society that they were trying to build, right? Yeah. So there are two examples. The Ithaca dollar is one of trying to play with alternative systems of circulation of money. Another one is to try to subvert what the official state structure is of basically holding the money, right? The banks.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and of course, money is power. So of course, people are going to rethink what that is and how we can work through that. Mm-hmm.
Another social structure that many of socially engaged artists have been interested in is communications, technologies, and social media platforms, right? And it's very tempting to look only at the most recent technologies, whether it's Facebook or the internet, but there's a long history of this. And since we're focusing on art from the last few decades and also social movements from the last few decades, perhaps a good place to start is the mail system. There's all kinds of amazing mail art projects, from Fluxus, a very famous network, or Conceptualism, to Eugenio Dittborn, an artist who the only way in which he was able to get his work out, subversive work, out of his totalitarian country, was precisely by folding his artwork in an envelope and getting it out, and then it would be exhibited as what we call now pop-up exhibitions, right?
I would love someone to send me some mail art. How awesome is that?
Well, and that's what, for a lot of these artists, they basically wanted art objects to circulate differently, not just for an artist to make them in studio, put them up on the wall in a museum, and that's it. They wanted art to surprise, imagine opening something. It was like gift giving, And so another really important case is the idea of radio, right? Yeah. In Japan particularly, pirate radio boomed in the 1980s. While it was not legally permitted, there were hundreds of radio stations, mini FM and pirate radio stations in Tokyo at one point in the 80s. And Tetsuo Kogawa is kind of the front figure in this movement, and you can learn from him how to build these radios online. We have that on our wiki. But something that's important to think of these radios, it wasn't just about distributing alternative content. They were thinking of the very structure of radio and using it in ways that nobody does. So for example, they would do what we call daisy chains, which is you broadcast something in one frequency, then
let's say from this building, and then your neighbor, who also has a pirate iPhone, receives it in their standard radio and then rebroadcasts it in the next frequency. So that way they were able to switch from like a mini community radio to like a citywide network whenever they wanted. Like if they had a really important message, they would go to the entire daisy chain, and if they only had one thing, then they would stick to their neighborhood frequency. So there's, and
just to say, revolutionary movements often, I mean, this isn't the social movements section, but it is useful to know radio has played a powerful role in terms of communicating alternative messages and producing community.
And that's a great point, Nato, because actually Tetsuo Koga was friends with Felix Guattari. Yeah. He was very inspired by Radio Alice, the autonomous radio in Italy. And so there's definitely a connection. And one of the things that we'll consistently learn in this MOOC is that the relationship between art and social bodies and social movements is fluid, right? Yeah. So of course, many of the examples we could learn in this module are not necessarily started by artists. They have artists as participants, right? Alternative currencies also, it's the same. The last example or case study in our idea of like communications technologies is the idea of TV. While TV may already seem outmoded, Radical works in that medium, that used it as a structure.
People think TV's dead, but it's like TV is king.
Science has failed. Heat is life. Time kills. Science has failed.
But a good example is like Chris Burden, an artist who realized that TV is about money. Many artists had tried to get on TV by doing something that calls everybody's attention, and then the reporters will come to you. But basically, if you weren't born into the group that has access to broadcasting, how do you get on TV? How do you get your message there? And Chris Burden realized,
how do you get your 15 minutes of fame?
You pay.
I would like to be the first artist to make a full public financial disclosure. My gross income for 1976 was $17,210. My business expenses totaled $16,156. This left me with a net profit for 1976 of $1,054. Thank you.
So Chris Burden basically paid for airtime. Yeah. So he was doing these radical performance pieces like crawling on broken glass and doing all kinds of strange things, almost getting himself electrocuted because there was a wire in the water, like a floor full of water, these strange performance pieces, right? But they were broadcast on TV because he paid for airtime. Wow. And so just imagine you're watching your normal TV show, your newscast or your soap opera, and here's Chris Burden crawling on glass, right?
And New York City alternative television was chock full of things. Paper Tiger television. There's a wonderful radical history of public access television with incredible programming.
In fact, guerrilla TV is part of what we would call this movement.
Yeah. So the next social structure we're going to investigate is what we're calling the state. What is the state? Well, the fun thing about art, I have to say, is that it basically thinks of everything as a form. So as opposed to thinking of the state, our government, our political system, as a given, artists or radicals can think of it as a malleable form that they can retool. So thinking of the state as something you can retool comes with a lot of benefits, because some of the things that come with the state are rights, laws, citizenship, social welfare systems. So in reinventing that, you can also rethink these things.
And some of you may be thinking, well, that's absurd. The state goes way beyond us. No individual controls the state. Even a powerful group doesn't control the state unless you believe in conspiracy theories, right? And or oligarchies,
Good,
but
good exception.
Yeah. But But the point being that states are enormous. Like, how can individuals have an impact in the state unless they're the president? Well, of course, there's the playful, poetic side to that, like trying the impossible. But there's also what we call micronations. Artists who said, well, I'll let the state be the state, but I'll try to create my own nation here in my immediate everyday life. That could be one approach, but the other could be, for example, Native American communities, many other populations who have not been allowed to participate actively in the life of the state. So they have to create alternative state structures.
I was thinking of Marcus Garvey, the Garveyites, where a radical African-American revolutionary who really believed in kind of producing a nation, a micronation for the black diaspora.
Exactly. Diasporas are another example of that, what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities. Communities that are so dispersed around the world that their nation is actually around different places, within different countries, right? So the first example we thought we would want to talk about is it's a group called Neue Slowenische Kunst, or better known as NSK. Can you tell us something about it?
So basically one of the things to think about with NSK, because they're an interesting group to talk about, because they're one of these groups that literally has different groups and different names that have circulated through it. So they have a group called Irwin, IRWIN. There's NSK. There's also a pop/industrial band from 1980 called Laibach. And all of them fit into what a kind of genre of playing with the state that Slavoj Žižek has called over-identification.
And this concept is actually, it sounds complicated, but it's relatively simple. It comes from psychology. And over-identification means when, for example, you want to identify with a powerful figure, and you don't have power yourself. Well, when you over-identify, it's like when a victim identifies with the perpetrator. And that happens quite often in psychology, but in the case of art or the state, is what other critics have called mirroring evil. In fact, there was an exhibition at the Jewish Museum many years ago of Israeli and Jewish artists who wanted to do work about the Holocaust, but identifying with the Nazi side. Really complex work, right?
And there was a protester, part of the alt-globalization movement, a gentleman named Andrew Boyd, who produced a political group called Billionaires for Bush. Basically being like, if the Republican Party is supported by billionaires, we're going to over-identify with them by promoting it as a billionaires' social movement.
There's even a great phrase that I think Shakespeare invented this, but it's in one of his plays. It may have existed before, that is called Out Herod Herod. Right?
Oh, really?
Like you go beyond that. Like you kind of outdo them. All kinds of even fashion manifestations are like that. Like exaggerating a trend, etc. But so with Laibach, what it meant was that they wanted to over-identify with all of the dark parts of Slovenian and Eastern European society. Their repressed, nationalist socialist dimension, the totalitarian side of socialism, and they just, instead of repressing it and saying, oh, we need to correct it, they would just play it out in public. So at their concerts, you would have everything from far left radical people to really conservative, like neo-Nazis. So it's a really problematic but interesting movement.
But they also went so far as to produce what they call their own state, which is the NSK state, which they are actually giving out passports. They, in fact, they want to have their own pavilion at the Venice Biennale, the way they want to actually produce a state with its own citizens.
And like with the currency, many of these things that artists do with social structure end up effectively being illegal. You're not allowed to have your really, citizens are not allowed to issue their own passports, right?
No.
But so these groups often do that in spite of certain laws. So Nato, can you tell us a little bit about Nowhere Islands, this really interesting project also about nations and micronations?
So an artist named Alex Harley, in collaboration with a group called Situations, produced a project where they basically floated an island from the Arctic to England, and it floated through international waters. Thus, the island became its own nation, playing on kind of the idea of international law and nation status. And when it became its own nation, they then began an online petition of gathering citizens where they acquired 23,000 citizens, and when it docked on the coast of England, it actually was redistributed to its citizenry as their own kind of place. So it's playing with international law with a physical place.
And what's kind of fascinating about some of these structures is that we are trying to present them as separate, but they actually flow into each other, right? Just like social art and artists flow into social movements and vice versa. And the state and the corporation in our days is actually quite hard to tell apart. But the next structure we're looking at is the corporation.
Yeah.
You can think that basically 50 of the largest corporations in the world are larger than the majority of national economies, right? And so many artists who are interested in these social structures have kind of wanted to do work about the corporation.
Yeah.
And Artmark is a really important example. Already a couple of decades ago, they started this group called Artmark. And they actually imitate, a bit in that model of the over-identification, they imitate the legal structures of the corporation. They even are registered as a corporation. But basically, stockholders, instead of owning stock, they propose radical actions, right? And that's kind of the stock. And so the kinds of things that they've done is like the Barbie Liberation Organization was one of their earliest pieces.
Yeah.
They took all the Barbie dolls and replaced the sound, contraption. And they basically replaced it with a G.I. Joe. So they effectively they queered all the Barbies, and they sent them back to the to the stores. So people were buying these Barbies that would speak like G.I. Joe.
Hey ho, let's go.
Yeah, exactly. And so these are
let's go.
really great, very playful, but also quite intelligent projects. A group that has become incredibly famous, but also has done all kinds of amazing work is the Yes Men.
Yeah.
Andy Bichelbaum and Mike Bonanno are their pseudonyms, but it's Igor Vamos and Jacques Servin are the artists, and they've impersonated all kinds of states, but also multinational corporations to basically expose what they call corporate wrongdoing.
Yeah.
And they've done, for example, for Dow Chemical, which the largest industrial disaster of our era was related to Dow Chemical and was in India, and thousands of people died in this chemical disaster. And to this date, people have been remunerated. And the Yes Men went live. They impersonated on the BBC. They impersonated a representative of this company, announcing that people would get remunerated and so on. The company then had to say that they wouldn't, and that this was a false statement. So, but that way they expose all kinds of structures of corporate power that they think are unjust.
And also, just to say, on to your point, I think one of the key things with this is by pretending to be a corporation, they also reveal that in fact a corporation is also a project by the powerful. It is also an art project of sorts.
Yeah. And in fact, many artists are also part of the powerful. So that's another thing that we can focus on.
That's a good one.
And can you tell us about the church? We haven't talked about it, but it's a really important.
So the church is another form that artists have taken on. I'm not going to get into Scientology because I'm a member. I'm joking. But the church, I'm talking about Reverend Billy and the Church of Stop Shopping. And the Reverend Billy is basically, it's now run by a woman named Savitra D. and the Reverend Billy. And it is a church that goes around preaching a kind of anti-capitalist, eco-friendly, holistic view of the world in the halls of corporate power. So they use the kind of idiom of the church. It's a kind of religious, fervent, holistic world. They got a choir, they sing, they show up in the middle of Starbucks. They might show up in the Disney store and talk about sweatshop labor. But in some ways, too, I think in a very sincere element, as opposed to just being a parody, I think they're also trying to reclaim a kind of spiritual journey towards reasonable attitudes towards our social lives.
That, and also the whole idea of charismatic leadership and emotion and affect, right? But there's the parody side, but I'm really happy you brought up the sincerity and the genuine, because so many elements of the left, that some of which we have listed around the world, are in denial about the importance of the church, religiosity, etc., in radical movements, right? And so artists like Reverend Billy really confront that and say, no, let's actually use that, and be emotional, be charismatic, etc., like church leaders do.
And you know what? Every time I hear him, I become a believer.
Yeah, of course. And in this case, it's a believer in environmentalism, right? And anti-consumerism, which is kind of in itself interesting.